Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we saw the origins and development of Kāvya tradition in Sanskrit. We saw how Sanskrit came to be used as a literary language, the origin of Kāvya tradition in Sanskrit, and the importance of Valmiki Ramayana as a text anticipating some of the crucial concerns of literary theory. Today, we are going to take a look at the languages in which Kāvya was composed. Could Kāvya be composed in all the languages? According to Sanskrit literary theoreticians, only 3 languages are fit for the production of Kāvya or literature. These 3 languages include Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa. Though Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa were the 3 primary languages, sometimes we would see literary theoreticians maintaining that there are 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 or 7 languages that are fit for literary production. Here we should note that the number increases not because new languages are being used for literary production, but because these literary theoreticians are considering the dialectical variations of Prakrit or Apabhramśa as a separate language. So later on, when I say that some literary theoreticians are considering 6 or 7 languages fit for the composition of Kāvya, I do not mean to say that new vernacular languages were slowly making their entry into the list of languages fit for literary expression. It is just that they are considering the dialectical variations of either Prakrit or Apabhramśa as separate languages. Unlike Sanskrit, for which literary theory acknowledges a single unified register, Prakrit was recognized from a relatively early date to have 3 or 4 regional types, namely Maharashtri belonging to Maharashtra, Shauraseni belonging to Shurasena, Gaudi or Magadhi belonging respectively to Bengal and Bihar, and finally Ladi belonging to Lata in southern Gujarat. Although the word Prakrit can refer to all these dialectical variations, the term Prakrit in the gamut of Kāvya is often used in a more restricted sense to refer to Maharashtri Prakrit, which was generally considered the best dialectical variation to be used in literature. The same was the case with Apabhramśa. In scholarly discourse, the term Apabhramśa refers to anything that in fact deviates from correct Sanskrit, but in literary circle, the term Apabhramśa denotes the dialect spoken by Abhiras. Abhira refers to a pastoral people in western India. Although Apabhramśa was initially considered a vulgar language, the negative connotations associated with it eventually gave way to recognition, and it was slowly given admission in the parlance of poetry or literature in general. The Vedic textual scholar Bhatta Kumarila's observation about the Buddhist scholars composing their works in Apabhramśa language marks the entry of Apabhramśa into the field of literature. Although Bhatta Kumarila's observation about the Apabhramśa language is quite derogatory in nature, it marks a historic shift in the 7th century. Kumarila says the scriptures of the Buddhists are linguistically corrupt and so could not possibly be holy word. When texts are composed of words that are grammatically false, with words of the Magadhan or Dakshinatya languages, and even worse, the Apabhramśas of these languages, how could their doctrines possibly be true? He says this in his work Tantra Vartika on Mimamsa Sutra. But an important thing that we need to note is that the Apabhramśa that is used in literature was a trans-regional variety and less local. In other words, the Apabhramśa found in literary texts was linguistically unlocalizable, largely without regional variation. it was processed in such a way that it can be used in a linguistically homogeneous manner by whoever uses it in the Sanskrit cosmopolis. Whatever may have been the original regional specificity of Prakrit and Apabhramśa, by the time of Bhamaha and Dandin, both the literary Prakrits and Apabhramśa had already been subjected to philological analysis and standardization. But the exact process through which Prakrit and Apabhramśa languages got standardized is still a matter to be explored. When I say that only these three languages were considered suitable for the creation of literary works, I do not mean to say that other languages were not used in Kāvya at all. While Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa were used to compose the whole literary work, secondary languages such as local dialects and local languages were used for mimetic purpose to emulate the speech of certain characters. For example, in a drama, the royal women always speak Shauraseni, ruffians in Magathi, and so on. These local languages were spoken by some of the characters in drama or literature to make a literary representation look natural. The bottom line of what I have been saying is that these local languages, other than the three languages we saw earlier, are used just to give a natural color to the story and representation. I will explain this point with the help of Udyodhana Suri's Kuvalayamala, which is a Sankirna or prose verse tale. The author notes that this tale is primarily told in Maharashtri Prakrit. This does not mean that there are no instances where the local languages are spoken in the story. During his travels, the hero wanders through the great bazaar of Vijayapura, where he hears people speaking 16 different Deshabhashas or local languages or languages of the place. To give the readers an idea of how the bazaar looked like, Udyodhana provides a snippet of conversation in these local languages. So, the work on the whole is composed in Prakrit, which is conventionally considered one of the three languages fit for the production of literature or Kāvya. But the local languages are mentioned only for imitative purposes. Writers as early as Bharata talks about these three language formula in poetic production. Although Bharata's observations are specifically in the context of drama, they can easily be made applicable in the case of Kāvyas as well. Bharata is also of the view that only three languages are used for the composition of Natya, namely Sanskrit, Prakrit and Deshabhasha. It is significant to note here that in place of Apabhramśa, Bharata uses the word Deshabhasha or the languages of place. As Pollock rightly points out, we can undoubtedly say that this is one of the earliest uses of a term that was to have a great afterlife in South Asian intellectual history. In drama, Bharata says, all the characters cannot indiscriminately speak Sanskrit, Prakrit and Deshabhasha. For example, Sanskrit is primarily used by the four kinds of heroes such as Thirodatha, Thira Lalida, Thira Utthada and Thira Shanta. They can also speak in Prakrit at times if need be, especially for imitative purposes. The prostitutes, since they interact with all kinds of people, should necessarily use Sanskrit language. This is good for learning arts also. This is the reason why they are speaking in Sanskrit as well. The celestial women will also have to speak in Sanskrit since they interact with gods. The saints, Brahmins and the noble ones should necessarily speak in Sanskrit. The poor and the extravagant ones should not speak in Sanskrit. They should always speak in Prakrit. The ones who have impersonated themselves as the ordinary ones, the Buddhists and the Jain monks should always speak in Prakrit. The same is the case with women, children, men with feminine qualities. They all speak in Prakrit. A celestial woman who is born on earth should speak only in Prakrit. So, According to Bharata, Prakrit is unsophisticated Sanskrit. In other words, in Prakrit, Sanskrit avoids its sophistication. There are three kinds of Prakrit in Natya: Samana Shabda, Vibhrashta and Deshigada. If the same words are used both in Sanskrit and Prakrit without any change, it is called Samana Shabda or Sanskrit identical. Bharata says that words such as Kamala, Amala, Renu, Taranga, Lola, Salila, etc. are used both in Prakrit and Sanskrit without any change. So Prakrit words that look similar to their equivalents in Sanskrit are called Samana Shabda. If the swara or vowel and vyanjana or consonant sounds in the samyuktakshara of a Sanskrit sound either change or get dropped, then it is called Vibhrashta or Sanskrit derived words. Deshigada is the regional variety of words. Finally, Bharata mentions 7 regional or local languages, namely Magadhi, Avandija, Prachya, Shauraseni, Artha Magadhi, Vahika and Dakshinatya. He also talks about 6 Vibhashas such as Shakara, Apira, Chandala, Shabara, Dramida and Andhra, and the low languages of the forest dwellers. After listing the languages, Bharata then proceeds to apportion them among various characters in a drama, just as he does with Sanskrit and Prakrit. For example, Magadhi is used in the king's harem. Artha Magadhi is used by royal servants, military men, merchants and so on. So the list goes like this. Bhamaha in his Kāvya Alankara also says that Kāvya can be composed in Gadya or prose and Padya or poetry. In this context, he also says that it is composed primarily in 3 languages, namely Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa. That it is possible to make Kāvya only in this triad of languages is the unanimous judgment of Sanskrit literary theory from its beginnings in Bhamaha and Dandin. Rudrada later lists the number of languages that are fit for poetic composition to 6. It should be noted that Rudrada's division is not at war with the observation of others, but it is simply because in addition of Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa, Rudrada also includes all the 3 varieties or variants of Prakrit as separate languages. The languages meant for Kāvya that Rudrada mentions include Sanskrit, Apabhramśa, Prakrit, Magadhi, Shauraseni, Maharashtri. You can refer to Rudrada's Kāvya Alankara for this. A century later, Rajasekhara imagines the linguistic body of Kāvya Purusha or the primal being of literature. Rajasekhara opines that the mouth of Kāvya Purusha consists of Sanskrit, arms of Prakrit, especially Maharashtri, groin of Apabhramśa, feet of Paishaji and chest of mixed language. This further shows that the choice of language for the composition of Kāvya always remained very limited for the poets. Pollock observes that this conception of a closed set of literary languages, proclaimed at the very beginning of the critical tradition and undoubtedly present from the very commencement of the era of Kāvya, remained in force for Sanskrit intellectuals even when new forms of vernacular literary culture were making their appearance everywhere from the beginnings of the second millennium. This is evident from the observation of Sharada Tanaya. Sharada Tanaya in his 12th century Bhava Prakasha observes that not all the languages are fit for the production or for the representation of the world in Natya. Sharada Tanaya observes that there are so many languages in this world. In a survey of language and region at the end of the work, the author acknowledges the variety of languages spoken in the vast world he is familiar with. He says that in Bharatavarsha there are around 18 languages by which people converse with each other. Some of these languages are named after the region in which they are spoken, but These languages, he says, are not fit for the production of Kāvya. He calls them the uncultured or mlecha languages. Sharada Tanaya declares that these local languages are not at all capable of executing the literary function. The languages used for drama or natya are the following 5, 6 or 7. This categorization varies depending upon how one categorizes language. If we categorize Sanskrit, Prakrit, Paishaji, Magathi, Shauraseni, then there are 5 languages. There are 6 if we incorporate their dialectical forms as a separate collective category. And some people reckon Apabhramśa as an independent 7th language. There could have been experiments in other local languages, but the fact is that they continue to remain experiments. The mid-11th century Kashmiri scholar Kshemendra's words merit attention here. In his Aujitya Vichara Charcha, Kshamendra advises the aspiring poets to listen to the songs and lyrics and rasa-laden poems in local languages and to go to popular gatherings and learn local languages. But the irony is that Kshamendra himself does not follow his advice. In the large portion of Kshemendra's literary corpus, there is not a scrap of anything but Sanskrit. Even the Buddhists, who took a very strong anti-Vaidika stance, consciously stayed away from composing kavyas in local languages. So Pollock observes that it is difficult not to conclude from this that aside from dramatic mimesis and the occasional pedagogical demonstration, multilinguality has a purely imaginary status in Sanskrit literary culture. In actual fact, a writer was a Sanskrit writer or a Prakrit writer or an Apabhramśa writer. It is also significant to note that although Kāvya could be produced in all these 3 languages, the creative writers often chose only one of these 3 languages while forming their oeuvre. In other words, they often chose to write primarily in one of these 3 languages. The 3 names that come to our mind when we think of such exhaustions for such experimentations in other primary languages are Rajasekhara, Vishwanatha and Anandavardhana. Rajasekhara opines that the poet should choose the language of his poetic composition with much forethought and after taking into account many aspects. What Rajasekhara says is that the choice of one of these 3 languages is not arbitrary at all. Rajasekhara opines, a poet must first of all fashion himself. He should ask himself, what is my inborn talent? What are my strengths with respect to languages? What does society favor? What does my patron favor? What kinds of poetic assemblies does he occupy himself with? What is he emotionally attached to? The poet should then adopt a particular language. So say the authorities. Moreover, a given language is adopted by virtue of its prevalence in a given region. As it is said, the people of Gauda or Bengal are devoted to Sanskrit. The people of Lata or South Gujarat are fond of Prakrit. The people of all Malava, the Thakkas or Punjabis and the Patanakas employ their own Apabhramśa. The people of Avanti, of Pariyatra and of Dashapura or Chhattisgarh use Paishaji or Bhut Pasha. The poet who dwells in mid-Madhya Desha is an expert in all these languages. Pollock says that Rajasekhara's ideal image of a poet's unlimited creativity in all 4 languages seems to be just ideal. If we examine the actual literary historical record available to us, admittedly counter-examples may have vanished, it is remarkable how very few writers produce literature in different primary languages. Rajasekhara himself, as an experiment, composed one play wholly in Prakrit titled Karpura Manjari. Remember, it is the only such play and was certainly an experiment. All the other works of Rajasekhara's oeuvre are in Sanskrit. Vishwanatha tells us he wrote only one Prakrit poem besides his Sanskrit works. The same is the case with Anandavardhana, who wrote a text titled Vishama Bana Leela in Prakrit for the education of poets. In addition to this, in addition to his courtly epic in Sanskrit, this shows that writers composing works in more than one primary literary language were quite rare. Munja, king of Paramaras, and Bhoja's uncle appears to be the only one Sanskrit poet who produced a serious corpus of verse in Apabhramśa as well as in Sanskrit. So far, we have been talking about the opinion of literary theoreticians. Now, let's turn our attention to poets to see how they are looking at this division of three languages. Abdul Rahman's Sandesha Rasaka is a case in point. Sandesha Rasaka is a messenger poem composed in the tradition of Kalidasa's famous Sanskrit poem Meghaduta. He identifies himself as an Apabhramśa poet and makes it clear that he considered himself part of the lineage of those who became poets in Apabhramśa, Sanskrit, Prakrit and Paishaji. One final example would be the story of Gunatya, the author of Brihat Katha, who was fated to observe a vow of silence in Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa. Gunatya, minister to the Shatavahana emperor, wages that the grammarian Sharvavarman will be unable to teach the king Sanskrit in 6 months, as he has pledged to do. Since Sharvavarman knows how difficult this task is, he throws himself at the mercy of Kartikeya, Shiva's son. The god's inspiration enables him to compose Katantara, or the brief system that reduces the proverbial 12 years required to learn Sanskrit by only half. By means of it, Sharvavarman was able to achieve his purpose and win the wager. Having failed in the wager, Gunatya was fated to observe a vow of silence in Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa, and he composes his Brihat Katha in Paishaji. So, as per the evidence that we have from the vast library of Kāvyas, we have only a few works in which local languages take the role of the primary languages of expression. Pollock's observation about the choice of Sanskrit as the medium of creative expression is noteworthy in this context. Pollock, in his Sanskrit literary culture inside out, says, accordingly, when poets choose to write in the Sanskrit language, they were choosing along with a certain aesthetic, a certain readership, in this case a cosmopolitan, virtually global readership. And they did this, we may accordingly infer, because they had something cosmopolitan, something global to say. The choice of the language for the literary production was always determined by the genre. The Mahakāvya or the courtly epic and the Akhyayika or the dynastic prose poem were composed only in Sanskrit. The Skandaka, which is a courtly epic genre differing from the Mahakāvya in metrical organization, and the Gatha, which is a type of erotic verse, were composed in Prakrit. Apabhramśa was the language in which Rasaka and Avaskandha, which are the two pastoral genres, were composed. No other language could be used as the primary chord for these genres, and no secondary uses of language are to be found in them. So, they are called Shuddha or monoglot literary forms. A Katha could be written in any of the three languages. The same was the case with the independent lyric called Muktaka. We can say for certain that, by and large, the genre rule held firm in the praxis of Kāvya. So, we have covered quite a few points in this class. Let's revise them once again. We have seen that only three languages were used to produce Kāvya, and these three languages included Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa. Sometimes Paishaji was also included. Among the various dialects of Prakrit language, only Maharashtri Prakrit was chosen to produce the Kāvya. Similarly, although the term Apabhramśa in scholarly discourse refers to anything that deviates from correct Sanskrit, in the literary circle the term Apabhramśa particularly denotes the dialects spoken by Abhiras. In other words, among the various dialects of Apabhramśa, only the dialects spoken by Abhiras were chosen for literary purpose or literary production. While Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa were used to compose the whole literary work, secondary languages such as local dialects or regional languages were used for the mimetic purpose to emulate the speech of certain characters. They never got elevated to the position of the primary language of the work. We also saw that although these three were considered equally fit for literary production, creative writers often chose to create their oeuvre in only one of these three languages. We elucidated this point with the help of three figures, namely Rajashekhara, Vishwanatha and Anandavardhana. Rajashekhara, in spite of his observation that one can produce Kāvya in all these three primary languages, did not try to create his oeuvre in all these three languages. Other than his work Karpura Manjari, written in Maharashtri Prakrit, he did not try to compose literary works in all these three languages that were available to him. He mostly remained a Sanskrit writer. The same was the case with Anandavardhana, who wrote only one Prakrit work titled Vishamabana Leela for the education of the poets. Finally, Vishwanatha tells us he wrote only one Prakrit poem besides his Sanskrit works. This shows that although the option of writing Kāvya in all these three languages, namely Sanskrit, Prakrit and Apabhramśa, was available to the creative writers, they often chose one of these three options for them. Finally, we saw that the choice of the language was mostly determined by the genre in which the creative writers were composing their work.